Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Role of Protein Intake in Healthy Aging. My name is Brigitte Reinhardt. I'm the Senior Marketing Associate at General Mills Food Service, and I will be the host for today's webinar. This webinar is sponsored by General Mills Food Service, providing the food people love away from home, and we're proud to offer the quality products food service professionals like you rely on for consistent results in your operation, as well as the beloved brands their customers know and trust. Today's webinar is supported by General Mills Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition. The Bell Institute is our company's internal source for scientific health and nutrition expertise. Before we begin today's program, I'd like to offer a few housekeeping reminders. Today's webinar will be recorded with a Q&A session at the end. However, you may submit questions at any time during the webinar by clicking the Q&A icon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. At the end of this webinar, you'll receive an email with links to the slides and continuing education credits certificates in the coming days. Please note approval by the Commission on Dietetics Registration for CEUs was not requested for this webinar. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's expert. Dr. Heather Leidy is an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin with a joint appointment in the Department of Nutritional Science and Department of Pediatrics through the Dell Medical School. She also serves as Director of Research Interest Groups for the American Society of Nutrition and was a member of the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. Her research focuses on how dietary protein quantity, quality, and timing impact satiety, healthy eating behaviors, and weight management throughout life. Dr. Leidy has a PhD in physiology from Penn State University and completed a post-doctoral fellowship at Purdue University. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Leidy. And with that, let's dive into the presentation. I hope you all enjoy.
All right, thanks so much. It's great to be here, and I really enjoy talking about dietary protein, and I think healthy aging is one of those topics that we really need to pay attention to. You know, being on the 2020 dietary guidelines, it really made me aware of the life stages. And so we know that as we age, aging healthy is a really important component. And how do we do that? And so we're going to kind of talk about that today. And so with that, I always just show this slide on the front end, and I'm generally an adolescent researcher. So I talk about it in these different life stage transitions, but I also have done some work across the lifespan. And so today we're really going to focus on this idea of preserving healthy lifestyles on the aging part. But when you look at this spectrum, you know, when we think about younger, it really is about establishing healthy lifestyles with that goal of, you know, growth and development. It's really the physical and mental well-being that we're trying to, you know, promote across the life stages. But when you're younger, it's more about establishing that and then optimizing it. And then as we age, it's really about preserving those behaviors. And so I think for me, the take home is, do we need to have life stage specific strategies? And I think as we start looking at the evidence, that is an emphatic yes, we do need those life stage specific strategies. And I think it's a really important component as we age. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And so just to set the stage, we are aging in America. In 2025, about 70% of the current population is over the age of 65. And so this is just some of the US Census data. And I teach a pretty large class. It's a fundamentals of nutrition class at UT. And when I showed this, I always like to put in some of this data, and the students they're kind of blown away at the fact that, you know, things have changed and we are aging in the US. A lot of it is because of medical care and just more education with whether, you know, being more physically active or nutrition. And so when you look at these data, you know, when you're looking at 65 plus, it's a rapid life stage in terms of increasing the number that we have. And so by 2016, some of those estimates are up to about 25% will be over the age of 65. And that intent is to, you know, how do we grow or how do we age healthy? And so we're going to talk about that. And so we want to just, hopefully you'll find this engaging. I always like it with webinars now to try to make this as active as possible. And so one of the questions I wanted to pose, just to get your opinion, you may or may not know, is what type of loss do older adults fear the most? And until I started digging into the research, I had one idea and I realized it's something different. So just if you can go ahead and take that, whether you think it's life, independence, whether it's financial concerns are the biggest one for older adults, loneliness, or just being safe. So go ahead and take that, and we'll give it a couple minutes to have you do, well, not a couple minutes, I always say that, a couple seconds to do that, and we'll see. And so I'm looking, let me see if I can reactivate this poll, and I'll go ahead and fill it out too. Okay, so the poll wasn't in yet. We'll just wait. So I'm just going to go to the next slide and kind of give you the answer, and then we'll see what you all said here in a minute. When we think about motivating goals for older adults, their number one main concern is to remain independent. And I used to think about that as like physically independent, but that mental piece is also really important. And so, I think, how does nutrition or other behaviors play a role within that? Another component when older individuals are surveyed, it's slowing the aging process, so decreasing aches and pains, reversing chronic disease, and then promoting health and well-being, right? And I feel like if you can take care of those first couple, then promoting health and well-being does play a really important role within that. And so I'm trying to see if I can, there we go, we'll review results. And so y'all did a great job. About 73% of you said that independence was the primary goal for older adults. Honestly, for me, I would have initially thought life or just loneliness, but it's really about independence. And, I think we're going to see some of the data that suggests that being able to maintain that lean mass or muscle can help a lot from a physical standpoint. And then establishing that healthy dietary pattern is really helpful mentally with that goal to being independent. So thanks for sharing that with me. And we'll do a couple of these as we go on today as well. So I wanted to start by saying, okay, that's the goal. So are we aging in a healthful manner? Unfortunately, I'm going to take us lower, and then we'll build back up in terms of what I think some of the strategies are. So many of us know that, at least in the US, whether it's across the lifespan, even in adolescence, we have a health concern, right? We do know that, obesity is still a high prevalence, and that comes along with those chronic diseases. And so if you see the ones along the bottom here, this is from the CDC data looking at, heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease. We also think of diabetes and kidney disease. Many of these are interrelated. But about 6 in 10 adults, just adults in general, have chronic disease. But I wanted to highlight it's even more critical in aging, right? About 8 in 10 adults, older adults, have one chronic disease, primarily cardiovascular disease, but that's also tied into obesity and diabetes. When you look at in terms of how many have 2 or more, it's 4 in 10 in all adults, but then 7 in 10 actually have 2 or more chronic diseases. And that does reduce obviously lifespan, but it also reduces, morbidity and mortality and just overall well-being. And so I think that's, for me, as well, what type of strategies can we do from a dietary standpoint to intervene? And then the next component that doesn't generally make the cut with chronic diseases is this idea of sarcopenia. So those of you that are aware of what sarcopenia is, it's just broadly, by definition, an age-related involuntary loss of skeletal muscle and strength, and they kind of go hand in hand. And the problem is it generally goes undiagnosed. And so those that have actually been measured, about 25% or a fourth of older adults have sarcopenia or are affected by sarcopenia, 65 plus. And then when you get into over the ages of 80, it's about 60%. But again, many people are just undiagnosed. And it's really hard. A lot of times with sarcopenia, we're just measuring lean mass or muscle. And that's really important, but it's the functional part of it, right? And I think being able to be functionally independent, being able to go up the stairs or to live by yourself, to take care of your grandkids, I think for most older people is really important. And it is founded in muscle. And so that's what we're going to touch on today in terms of the role of dietary protein. Taking this a step further, this is some data from David Church and Stu Phillips' work and many others on muscle losses with aging. And so this figure is showing muscle mass across the life stages. And you can see, typically, I would say peak muscle mass is generally, same thing with peak bone mass. It's somewhere around 25 years of age. And so we see that there's this steady increase in adolescence and then into a young adulthood. And then you see this steady progression over time in terms of losing muscle, right, over these decades. And where it becomes a problem is if you look at the blue line, and then below that, the shaded part, that's really what we would consider the disability threshold. And so once you drop below about 75%, you get into more of that disability component. And then something also that I think most aren't aware of is that when it drops to less than 70%, that's considered the zone where there's a high risk of death. And so we do know that muscle and the amount of muscle that we have does tie into to morbidity and mortality. And so that's really where we need to start thinking about how do we intervene and how do we preserve as much lean mass as we have. And you can see the amount of muscle that gets lost. You know, when you look at per decade from 40 to 70, it's about 8% of muscle loss. And that does translate into a significant loss in muscle strength and function. And then obviously it goes even higher after 70. Just to put some other numbers down, when you look at it across the lifespan, once you hit 25, so it's about a 1% loss in muscle mass as we age. Obviously, the slope gets a little bit different depending on the life stage, but also strength. There's about a 3% loss in strength as we age per year as well. And so when you look at the differences, we are losing more strength than we are losing muscle. And so that, you know, it's just something that we need to be focusing on. And there's some other data. There was a review that came out recently just to hit this concept home in terms of muscle, because I think a lot of times we just think of muscle, and I'm a power lifter. And so I think about muscle and just power and strength. And I am aging, so we start thinking about functionality, right? And it does play a role in functionality, but also survival. And so this is a review that illustrates all these different conditions that we see here, whether it's surgery, cardiovascular disease, liver disease, or community care. And these are the studies with improved survival. So the percent of survival that you see with all these different conditions when lean mass or muscle is improved. And so pretty consistently, when you have an increase in muscle, you have an increase in survival. And I think for aging individuals, I think even, you know, sharing that information with them can be really important. And then just to go back a little bit further too, in terms of sarcopenia. And so this is just to visually show you what's happening from a physiological standpoint. A cross-sectional view of the lower leg, and we're looking at it from aging and then with obesity, because one of the things that we also know with sarcopenia, there's a subcategory called sarcopenic obesity, and that's simply an individual that is losing lean mass or muscle and functionality, but also has obesity. So they have additional adipose tissue that can also create a problem. And so when you look at the cross sections, this is just a normal healthy individual with, you can see how much muscle that's there. So obviously that white in the middle is the femur bone, and then the muscle is the darker component, and then fat around the outside. When you look at normal versus an individual with sarcopenia, you can see how there's a lot of fatty infiltrates, right? And there's just less lean mass that we see. And we know that lean mass directly correlates with function. But when you look then comparing an individual that has obesity, obviously you can see here, muscle mass isn't dramatically different from a normal individual. It's just the amount of excess fat that gets surrounded and infiltrated into the muscle. But then with sarcopenic obesity, we do see, you know, it's kind of a double whammy, that there's an excess fat, you know, both around the muscle and within the muscle, but then the amount of lean mass is lost. All right. And so that's really what we're dealing with aging. So it's a tricky condition. I'd say adolescence is probably the hardest thing to study, but now when I think about it, aging is difficult because you have, I would say most, if you were to look at them, the majority are either one of two conditions. They're either not eating enough and they have sarcopenia, or that's possible that they're overeating and they're in an excess, but they also, or I'm sorry, that they just have sarcopenia, or that they have sarcopenic obesity. And so it comes with some challenges. And for healthcare providers and dietitians, you have to really identify where that person is and try to tailor it accordingly. So again, just to summarize here, just maintaining muscle health, I think, is a really important component as we age. I won't spend a lot of time on here, but I just want to give a shout out for anybody in here that is an aging female, aging woman, because I think this is an understudied population. And when we overlay the fact that hormonally with women as we age, very different, that leads to different conditions compared to men. And menopause is really can create a metabolic challenge in this population. And so obviously, you know, in your 30s, you have ample estrogen levels, but then around that 40 to 50 age lifespan, you start seeing that decline in estrogen, which is considered perimenopausal. But right away, I mean, most of us, I think it's when you go through menopause is when you start having, you know, risk of bone, lean mass losses, changes in metabolism, cardiovascular disease risk, but it's actually happening during perimenopause. So in that 40 and 50 year span where you start getting all these different negative health risks. And so I think it's when we think about intervening, and this presentation is not really about intervening young, but it is just to give a take home. If we really, guys and girls, we do really need to start intervening in our 40s and 50s. And I think it's really important for women because as they transition into menopause, if we're not ready for that from a behavioral standpoint, it can really wreak havoc on some of the health outcomes. So I just wanted to more of a give a shout out with, aging in women. I think that's even more important to think about protein and preserving muscle. And so kind of switching gears, now that I've painted a really bad picture of that we're just not healthy as we age and what can we do, it's okay, well, how does that align with the American diet, right? So how healthy are we in the US, and is the aging population any better? And I would say when you look at the Healthy Eating Index, so those of you that aren't aware, the Healthy Eating Index is a measure of diet quality that is supposed to align with the dietary guidelines. Really, that the dietary guidelines are designed to set up for healthy dietary patterns that promote health and well-being. And so the goal would be to be at 100, right? That we're meeting our dietary needs. And right from the get-go, you can see that no life stages are anywhere close to 100. And when I talk about this with my students, they're like, it's not that bad. And then I tell them, well, do you want to have, 56 as a grade in the class? And then they get it, right? So obviously many life stages are only meeting half of the guidelines. When we look at 60 plus, it's a little bit better. I mean, it's the highest one that we have, but even a 63 really suggests that we're under consuming the things we need to be consuming and over consuming others. And so just to highlight that, very similar across the life stages, generally older adults do over consume saturated fats, sodium, and added sugars. And we know that many of these are tied into cardiovascular disease risks as well as others. And then under consuming, there is a higher prevalence of under consuming just total calories or food intake. And then also fruits, vegetables, whole grains, dairy, and then specifically too with protein. Protein is very unique as we age, that there's some underconsumption. So when you take guidelines and then it's a nice way of overlaying, well, do we see nutrient deficiencies or inadequacies based on this? And we do. And so when you look at from a nutrient standpoint, there's a higher risk of nutrient inadequacies in different populations. What this is highlighting is these are the typical nutrients of public health concern for underconsumption. So basically every life stage is underconsuming calcium, potassium, vitamin D, and fiber, aging adults as well. And then there's other life stages where there's inadequacies. Iron is one of those ones, in younger and then in teens, although teens are inadequate in all of these. And I just didn't list them all because the focus today was really looking at an aging population, but we just focus on that. I'd say protein is one of those ones that is leading to a nutrient inadequacy, as well as B12. And we know that a lot of those protein-rich foods can supply a number of these micronutrients. And so that's why we're going to have a discussion the rest of the time about what increased dietary protein looks like in aging and are there any benefits. And so this is just to give you a real quick summary. There are research articles that tie in with all of these, typically in adults, but now we're going to start focusing on that aging population. And so really, what is the role of dietary protein to promote healthy aging, and is there a benefit with increased protein, right? So we're not going to talk about growth and development just because that's in a younger population, but we do know that protein needs are higher as we age. But then also looking at strength and performance, weight management, functionality, and some of these other outcomes. Some of these are just related to weight management, at least down here at the bottom. But you do see differences with increased dietary protein. And then the bottom right here, sorry, I'm using my mouse and I realize that you're not seeing it. Hopefully you're tracking with me. But if you look at the bottom right, the nutrient adequacy piece is something that I didn't think about. I'm a protein researcher by training, and I just think about it from that lens, but I do whole protein food studies. I very rarely do supplementation studies just for what I'm focusing on. And it occurred to me that, well, when you're eating protein rich foods, they accompany along with a lot of micronutrients that we need. And so we're going to have a brief conversation about that today as well. But to start off, we're just going to focus on two of these main outcomes I think are really relevant for aging, and that's strength and performance. That's really going to be tied into body composition or lean mass, and then looking at functionality or preventing sarcopenia. All right. And so when I first started looking at this, I present with colleagues that specifically target aging. Stu Phillips is one of them, and a number of other ones. But I wanted to get to make sure that I had the up-to-date evidence. And so I just typed in aging and meta-analysis with protein. And I was shocked to see how many meta-analysis have come out since 2017. Generally, you have one or two. And I would say even with adults in general, not with aging, there's maybe one or two in the last 5 to 10 years. They're like, yeah, you can cite that. And it's encompassing pretty crazy. And so I wanted to take a screenshot and show you that these are 2, 4, 6. There's 6 here. And then I'm going to really just take 2 of these out and highlight them. But it's amazing to me the focus on aging with protein and then looking at muscle mass, strength, and function. And so, many of these are looking at protein supplementation. Some are specifically highlighting one particular supplement, whey protein supplementation. This one is looking at dose, frequency, and timing of protein. There's others that look at protein in the diet. Some look at resistance exercise, and some look at the health status. And so I would say collectively, when you look at all these systematic analyses and just look at the take-home message, we do see that increased protein with protein supplementation. So in essence, it's typically adding protein to somebody's habitual diet can increase lean mass pretty consistently. And I would say some markers of strength and mobility in older adults, as long as, and I put the ... because we're going to talk about this next, but as long as what? Well, I think there's some pretty key factors when you start teasing out all of these meta-analysis because they're focusing on many different things. And I think it's going to drive the overall take-home message. And so with that, I just wanted to talk about those things to consider. So the first and foremost is some of these meta-analysis have resistance exercise studies and some don't. And we do know that by itself, resistance exercise is the number one strategy to increase or preserve lean mass or muscle as we age. Hands down, pretty consistently, with or without nutrition or other interventions, we do see that resistance training improves body composition, particularly lean mass with aging. We do see this increase with muscle strength, and that's with upper body, lower body, and then a lot of times hand grip strength is used as a marker, and it's a fairly strong marker or a marker of overall strength. We can see that it can help with body pain. It can also help with mental health and including depression with aging, social function, and general health. So always have to think about that with these studies. What is the importance of resistance training within these? The next one then is the health status. And so it's whether these studies or whatever you're involved with, whether it's about preventing the progression of a disease, whether it's just prevention in general or whether you're treating a condition, right? And so there are studies that just look at maintaining health and healthy aging adults. But I would say one of the ones that is the more focused or more critical would be in sarcopenic or frail individuals, older adults. And this is some work that Doug Patton-Jones had done and actually categorized this term, the catabolic crisis model. And so this model is really looking at, this increase in sarcopenia. So as we age, we have a decrease in muscle mass. But it's not as linear as we think it is, right? And so the catabolic crisis model simply means when there's a crisis that occurs with aging, whether it's you fall down the stairs or whether you had pneumonia or COVID and you're hospitalized and you have these different events that cause you to be immobile, then what is the role of dietary protein, right? Or being able to preserve that lean mass. And so I think the health status also does play a really important role. And then the last one that we just don't have time to touch on, but we will touch on a few of these, but won't go into a ton of detail, is all these other different dietary factors that are related to protein. How much protein, whether it's in a meal across the day, the type, whether we're really talking about supplementation or within a dietary pattern. And that's also really important for aging individuals because sometimes, many of you know, if you work with this population, they have a really hard time eating the amount of protein or food in general that is recommended. I'm going to just briefly touch on the quality of the protein in terms of animal versus plant, and then that distribution in terms of do you need to be having protein at every eating occasion. So we're going to touch on these, but I wanted to make mention of this because a lot of the systematic reviews that I just showed and what I'm going to show you further really are related to these aspects. And so let's dig into some of the research. I think before I do that, I wanted to just mention, because I don't do a lot of comparisons throughout the rest of the presentation about, well, okay, fundamentally, are there differences with protein needs in young versus older adults, right? Because if there isn't, why are we having this discussion? Why don't we just have one recommendation? That recommendation is pretty solidified in the literature. And so this is just some data from Dan Moore's group in 2015 that looked at protein synthesis. So it's skeletal muscle protein synthesis. So in essence, it's the mechanism in terms of how we build lean mass or muscle, comparing young and older when different protein intakes were given. And so if you look at the figure on the left here, this myofibril FSR is just a representation of muscle protein synthesis. So this thing downstream lean mass gains, but it's at the mechanism level. All right. And then the bottom, the x-axis is looking at protein intake, right? And it's reported as grams per kilogram of body weight. And so what I want to show you is In younger adults, as you can see, when your protein is 0, there's a baseline level of skeletal muscle protein synthesis, right? We know in our bodies where we build protein, we break it down. As you start increasing your protein intake, you start seeing that there's an increase in skeletal muscle protein synthesis, right? And then along the way, you start seeing that slope just stops, and that's called the breakpoint analysis, where more protein just levels off, that you don't get an increase, in essence, that there's a certain point where you're maximally stimulating muscle protein synthesis. When you look at this in young adults, that breakpoint is around, on average, about 0.24 grams per kilogram of body weight. But you can see the range there is, a little bit less, about 0.18 to 0.3. So we always think about 0.3 is really that amount that break point is in young adults. I also put it in grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, thinking about that 0.8, which is the RDA for protein. So we see that with young adults. And then when you start looking at older adults, you can see that the slope of the line is definitely different, and it's a more gradual increase, to the point that when you look on the right-hand side with the older adults, their break point is further along, really suggesting that they need more protein to maximally stimulate protein synthesis, right? And that average is about 0.4, could be as high as almost 0.6. And so now you're dealing with about 1.2 grams of protein, so much different than young and old. And so I bring that up to say there is a difference in terms of protein requirements in older adults, based on some of this data. And then there's others that have also supported that. And so with that said, I just want to turn to what I think is probably the most comprehensive meta-analysis. And this was a meta-analysis done, I think last year or a year before, the references at the top there, looking at randomized controlled trials, assessing increased protein intake, generally from supplements, but looking at lean mass, muscle strength, and then physical function. But I like this study, or this meta-analysis, because they also did subgroup analyses with those factors that I mentioned, right? So it's looking at, okay, with or without resistance training, with or without, with aging, which is really thinking about that as we age, we do have a higher risk of sarcopenia, and then protein quantity. And so what you're going to see here for the next couple slides is there's some forest plots that highlight this, and then I'll show the actual data in the table. So the table is showing that standard mean difference, but then the forest plot in this case is showing all the RCTs that are in this meta-analysis together. And if you're not as accustomed to looking at forest plots, I think this is supposed to be a tree. And so if you look at this, the orange line down the center is the 0 pivot. And so if collectively the standard mean difference is shifted to one side or the other, and it's not touching the line, that's considered significant. And so you can see here on the right, if it's shifted to the right, it's favoring a protein supplementation, or the protein supplementation studies, versus those that had the control arm within that, but that would be to the left. All right. And so when you look at the table, looking at just lean mass, including all the RCTs that had 66 trials, there was a significant difference. That's the P is 0.01. And so if you go back to look at that forest plot, you can see how the triangle at the bottom is the sum. And so you can see that it's shifted to the right. It's not at 0, it's close, but it isn't really suggesting that increased dietary protein with all these studies in aging is beneficial for lean mass. But then they went a step further, and then, I'm sorry, and this is just the actual, so the standard mean difference is the difference. When you look at the averages in the control group, in general, is about 0.5 kilograms that was gained throughout these studies, whereas if it was a protein supplementation, it's about 1.3 kilograms, right? So that's kind of the differences that we're dealing with. And I think with aging, it's not that they're bulking up or gaining a ton of lean mass, but I think even preserving what we have is a really important component. But we do see some increases here with dietary protein. Then what they did is they sectioned out studies that had no resistance exercise, so that's the RE, versus those that had RE, which is resistance exercise. And so when there was no resistance exercise included, no differences in terms of no benefits with protein with lean mass. But when the studies included resistance training in both groups, in the control group and the protein group, you do see a significant benefit with increased dietary protein. So now you have to start thinking, when you're making recommendations, is there is a really important component with when resistance training is included. Going a step further, they then looked at those within that resistance exercise, those resistance exercise groups, those that were younger, so less than 65, and those that were greater than 65. And so I would say, both were definitely the less than 65 did show a significant difference with protein, but I would say 0.06 is a trend and we should be mindful of that. And I just brought in that forest plot there. So the forest plot that you see that's a little bit smaller, those are the studies that included individuals that were 65 plus. You can see it's, it's close to that line. It's a little bit on closer to that 0 point, but I think it's a trend. And so in general, I think having increased protein with resistance training with greater than 65 years is still beneficial. And then lastly, this meta-analysis broke it out according to how much protein. So it was whether the groups had less than 1.2 versus greater than, the range was 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. I apologize, there's a typo there. It should say kilograms or grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. And when you look at the p-values here, both groups, those are less, well, the less than 65 was a trend. Those that were older, the 65 plus, that were eating 1.2 to 1.6, you see a significant benefit there. And then I just brought in that other forest plot. So again, you can see here that having resistance training with this protein quantity about 1.2 to 1.6 in older adults can be beneficial for lean mass. Looking at muscle strength, we see twofold. I'm just going to show you the lower body data for today, just mainly due to time. So again, regardless of all those other factors, the randomized control trials that included increased dietary protein, which is then that first row on that table, was different, suggesting that protein supplementation can help with lower body strength. But you typically just see that with resistance exercise, right? That's the third row down. When you see without exercise, not different, but when protein supplementation is including with resistance exercise, we do see that significant difference there. Young and old, it doesn't really matter. And then oddly, the protein amount didn't actually play a role looking at lower body strength. All right, so again, we always have some differences when we're starting to look at this data. But in terms of muscle strength, came out with some of those, but not really targeting that specific amount of protein. And then the orange square over here is just talking about the fact that they also looked at upper body and hand grip strength and found little to no effect of protein. So it was really focusing on that lower body aspect in terms of muscle strength. Less studies exist in terms of functional outcomes, which I think for me is really where we want to be with aging. And functional strength is usually being able to go upstairs or taking your gait walks or how far you can go, those types of things. And so when you look at the table here, we do see all of the studies that were included. So with this one is 15 trials. There was an effect of increased protein in general on functional tests. Oddly, it doesn't really come out with resistance exercise at all. So we just see an overall effect with having more protein outside of resistance exercise. But I did want to point out, so this was just one meta-analysis, and then there was another one by Stu Phillips' group that also looked at whey protein supplementation with and without vitamin D. That should be a trigger like, oh, I didn't realize that vitamin D might play a role in lean mass or muscle functionality, and we're starting to see that it does. But I wanted to highlight this because this is a one that specifically targets older adults that either are healthy or have sarcopenia or frail or have frailty. And what you can see here is there's an overall effect with increased dietary protein and vitamin D in all trials with functional tasks. But what you start seeing is a greater benefit in individuals who have sarcopenia or are frail, right? Because the healthy individuals those studies didn't really show an effect. It was really more about those that had sarcopenia and frailty. All right. And so again, just thinking about who is the most, who could benefit the most from increased protein, you can kind of see it from that standpoint. So just wanted to summarize that because it's sometimes hard when we think about it, but I would say collectively, because most of those studies were protein supplementation. And so I'd say adding more protein to a standard diet is an effective treatment. I would say it's more critical in individuals who, if you got a poll, you can take an hour wait. I just popped up a little bit early. But in individuals, and that's my fault, I added a slide this morning, and so my slide numbers were off. So I apologize for that. But anyways, I think protein supplementation is important in older adults, but I think it's most critical in individuals with sarcopenia and frailty. But then I do think it has to be included with resistance exercise because a lot of those effects that you don't really see with just giving protein, it has to come with that resistance exercise for that stimulation to occur. And I don't think that message is always as clear to older individuals. But I think being active, and it doesn't necessarily mean being in the gym pumping iron, but having that resistance exercise, and being more active with protein is kind of the double benefit there. And so the last one thing that I wanted to cover before we kind of get down to those protein factors is the weight management piece, because I think a lot of times we think of weight management in younger adults, or even middle-aged, but older adults could also benefit from that if they are experiencing sarcopenic obesity, right? So I'm just going to show you a meta-analysis on that, and that really kind of covers when you think about obesity and how it's related to cardiovascular disease. I think it's a really important component. And so this is a review by Wayne Campbell in 2016 that reviewed 24 energy restriction randomized control trials in older adults. And so this is really where we're thinking of, is that these older adults were overweight or had overweight or obesity. And this meta-analysis sectioned out normal and high protein based on whether it was less than 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight per day or greater or equal to 1. In older adults. And so what you're going to see here are there's, weight loss, fat mass loss, and lean mass losses. Again, these are energy restriction trials. So the goal was to reduce their calories. It was about a 500 to 750 calorie reduction in their calorie level. So taking whatever they were eating, reducing it down by 500 to 750. They weren't eating that. It was a reduction down. And then just seeing whether there's greater or less weight loss, fat loss, and then lean mass losses. And so what all of these bars are, if you look at the left for weight loss, it's really showing you normal protein or high protein, and then whether there was a greater, for weight loss, it's greater than 10 kilogram per loss, whether it was less than or greater than 5 or less than 5. I think the take-home message is just really looking at the percentages and what they're different. And so long story short, when you look at it from a weight loss standpoint, we don't really see differences depending on protein amount in the diet with energy restriction in aging adults. Weight loss was typically the same. If you think about it, they were in a tightly controlled energy restriction. So if they were following it, it's not surprising that we saw that there were no significant differences with weight loss. But we do see differences in fat mass loss. So if you look at the center there and just go down to the bottom with the high protein where it says 55% with the asterisk, that's really where there was a bigger difference. That this is the amount that was lost, right? So it's that 7 to, it's less than 7 to greater than 5 kilogram loss. We do see that there was greater fat mass losses with the higher protein energy restriction diets than the normal protein. It was in that range. And so again, looking at it from a body composition standpoint, and then when we're losing body fat mass, which is really advantageous if we're overweight or have obesity, but the goal is really to retain some of that lean mass. And that's what we see in the right-hand side where it says lean mass loss. So again, looking at it with normal protein and high protein, and if you look at the asterisk there with that 31%, you can see, and same thing with, the 53% and the 16. So regardless of how much lean mass was lost, all of those amounts of lean mass losses were less when the individuals were following a higher protein diet compared to normal protein. So they were able to retain that muscle during that energy restriction. And so this is a really good example of how we think about it for weight management. We do see that with older adults. And so now I just want to transition into, okay, so now we see that there are benefits with protein. How much do we need? What type and things like that? And we're going to spend the last 10, 15 minutes talking about that. So just if we could, maybe we can launch that Insta poll now just to see what you all say in terms of are older adults meeting their actual requirements for protein. All right, so based on what I talked about today, and we'll get down to the nitty gritty, but in your opinion, do you think that older adults are actually meeting their requirements? Is it yes, no? I'm not sure. It depends. And maybe it depends on those factors that I talked about. So if we can launch that, great. If not, it's okay too. But we'll go ahead and if it pops up on your screen, go ahead and take it. And if not, we'll go ahead and talk about the kind of the recommendations in this next piece. And so this is just showing some of the current NHANES data that we have in terms of protein intake across the life stages. So on the left-hand side, it's current intakes in males and females, and the little line that goes across, that's really, and I realized that somehow that got shifted, or my line got shifted, so I apologize. Most of you know from a RDA standpoint that protein intake requirements are typically 0.8. So I'm very sorry. I don't know why that shifted down to 0.6. But the line should be about 0.8 because that is the recommendation for all life stages outside of younger children and adolescents is a little bit higher, but 0.8 there. And so if you bump up that line to 0.8, we can see that in general, they're meeting the RDA of 0.8. But what I will tell you is on the right-hand side, based on the evidence that I showed today from the meta-analyses, we're not really meeting that, right? And so when you think about it with sarcopenia or even weight management, and we look at the data, it goes back to these recommendations. And so I would say first and foremost, endurance or resistance training, exercise 3 to 4 days a week is really important. And then thinking about, in essence, minimum protein intake, right? And so there's where I would say the goal would be and where I think a lot of the research is suggesting with aging. I think first and foremost, in healthy adults and healthy aging adults, I think we're really thinking about 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. If you remember, that's that Dan Moore's work. If you don't want to look at it across that, across the diet, when you think about it with per eating occasion or per meal, it's about 0.3 grams per kilogram per eating occasion. And that is roughly about 30 grams of protein at each meal. And we would say generally about 3 to 4 times per day to get at that amount. But when you're thinking about any type of chronic disease as we age, whether it is with sarcopenia or even individuals that have obesity, then I think it needs to be higher based on the evidence, about 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. And that equates to about 0.4, about 40 grams of protein. And this is pretty consistent with the aging population in terms of how much protein they actually need. All right. And so most of the evidence that I showed within those meta-analysis is really highlighting that. And so just to point that there about the 1.2 to 1.6, I think there is room for improvement because most Americans, I don't know if you said that, but most aging adults are not in that's and definitely for females, we're below that range of what's needed. And so just to wrap up or just briefly touch on these dietary factors, I just wanted to go back to this idea of protein. Whether it's quantity, supplementation, quality, and distribution for the last little bit of time that I have for today. And so we'll see if this one will launch. It may or may not. And I'm sorry, it may be here and I'm just not seeing them pop up. And then, oh, there we go. Okay, perfect. So hopefully this poll popped up. It says, which protein factor has the greatest impact on health? Is it quantity, quality, form, or timing and distribution? And so we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about that today. So in your opinion, what do you think? It's obviously we would want to target on all of these, but there is really one that is driving a lot of the effects. And we'll cover that in the next couple minutes. And so what I wanted to start with is the idea of quantity, because I just mentioned about, somewhere between 30 and 40 grams of protein. And we get asked a lot of times with aging, it's like, well, they can't actually eat that much, right? They get full really fast. And so this is a meta-analysis from 59 studies looking at appetite and food intake, comparing young versus older adults. And so this is the data that suggests that when you're comparing to younger adults, older adults do have reductions in daily intake. They have less morning hunger, less post-meal hunger, and they also have greater morning fullness. So this is pretty significant when you're up at that 40% range. And so this is suggesting that a lot of times older individuals, it's not that they're proactively reducing their intake, they just don't have that stronger appetite or strong food craving desire to eat. And that creates a challenge, right? Because it can be difficult at times for them to consume the amount of protein that we're advocating. And the biggest reason is if most of you know the protein world, which is what I've spent most of my time, last 15, 20 years looking at protein and satiety, is we do know that when and this is in middle-aged adults, but when you're eating more protein, which is in the red, you do have lower hunger at every eating occasion and throughout the day and greater fullness throughout the day. Really helpful to promote healthy weight management in most people, but when you're thinking about it in aging and you're wanting them to eat the amount of protein, if that's the same thing that they have this elevated feeling of satiety or fullness, it could be a big challenge to do that. So it's just something to consider. But there's a recent meta-analysis that came out that was focusing on the impact of protein on appetite and daily intake in older adults. And so this is the data in older adults looking at how much energy they're actually consuming. And it was based on whether they were having more protein or less protein. And the concept was if they're eating more protein, they probably are reducing their intake because they're just full all the time. And again, if you look at that forest plot, we can see that the overall mean is the standard mean is right in the center of that 0. So this does suggest that protein is not impacting, the amount of protein is not impacting appetite and having an effect on reduced daily food intake in older adults, right? And so it's maybe not, but I do think there's some other factors that we need to be mindful of, but maybe this isn't as big of a factor as we initially thought in terms of trying to boost that protein up. And the reason I say, are there any other factors, is because I've done some work in the past in older adults looking at food form and portion size. So these are just smaller portions versus larger portions. But what I want to highlight is when we're talking about having older adults drink or eat their protein foods, right? So having a protein beverage versus having them eat their food. And what you can see here is this is looking at hunger and then fullness, and then this is a hormone called ghrelin. And what you can see is, when they're having those solid foods, you're going to see, this a bigger decline in hunger throughout that morning time period compared to whenever you have the beverages. So that's the upper left hunger one. And it's the same thing, whether it's a lower portion or a higher portion. In terms of fullness, if you look on the right-hand side with the bigger portion, you do see that eating your food elicits a much bigger feeling of fullness compared to drinking your food. And that accompanies along with with ghrelin and some of those other hormonal responses. And why did I bring that up? Is because for older adults, having those protein supplementations in a beverage form may be more helpful to get that protein in, simply because our body doesn't experience beverages quite the same as food. And if there is a challenge of having them just feel full, this could be one strategy that can help. In terms of distribution, a lot of times you've probably seen this skewed versus even, and looking at, do we need to evenly distribute that protein across the day with breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Most people will have a little less at breakfast, a little more at lunch, and then a lot at dinner. And so does the even distribution pattern come out? I would say right now, universally, even in older adults, there's 8 studies that have been published. And I would say 2 of them show a benefit with evenly distributing across the day, and the rest just don't. There doesn't show a big benefit with that. And so, again, it's tricky because if you're really advocating for protein, a certain amount of protein at each eating occasion, it does suggest that. But if you remember the poll that you just took, and I'm sorry, I'm just having a really hard time seeing the results for these. But if you took the poll, the number one factor that's driving a lot of these is the amount. So totally the amount within an eating occasion is driving a lot of these health benefits, whereas the distribution or some of these other things may not play a significant role, as big of a role as just the amount to start with. But I did want to call your attention to, this is some data from Stu Phillips. It was some NHANES that sectioned out having 1 or 2 meals a day, looking at strength and lean mass. And so it's a little bit kind of, I don't want to say it's difficult to see, but if you just look at the black lines, this is looking at 2 meals versus the gray lines are 1 meal. And within those gray and black, it's whether you're looking at its strength or lean mass, but they kind of go hand in hand. And this one does suggest that, if you're looking at how this is rising with protein, at that 30-gram amount is really where you start seeing a little bit of a break point, but it does suggest that having more meals with more protein can help with increased strength and lean mass. So it does support this idea of distribution, but a lot of the straight up distribution studies don't really they're not really coming out the way we anticipated. So I think it comes down to just, it's almost however you can get that amount of protein in across the day seems to have a bigger effect. And then the last piece that I just want to touch on today, and due to time, I'm not going to go into the rest, but when we think about protein quality, this is just a table that looks at the different amino acids that we see within the different types of proteins. And we know that, essential amino acids are driving a lot of the health benefits, or like lean mass or muscle protein synthesis. And so, at times targeting or focusing on animal source proteins is a little bit more advantageous, given that they do have a higher essential amino acid density. But I would say, mixing and matching your proteins is ideal. And when protein quantity is sufficient, protein source actually has a very minor effect. And so that's really the take-home message that I wanted to convey in that slide. Again, if you are having this plant and animal dietary pattern, then it kind of takes care of itself as long as that protein quantity is there. But with that said, I do want to acknowledge that we also need to remember about nutrient adequacy, right? And so there's a number of studies that have come out, actually, most are from Vic Fulgoni's work, that just show that whether it is animal source proteins or plant-based proteins as a whole food, you do start seeing all these circles are illustrating the differences when people have these foods in their diet versus those that don't. And many of these are these nutrients of public health concern. Also, you can see here, with vitamin B12 and protein, with many of these in aging populations, that a lot of the inadequacies can be reduced when they are consuming high quality protein rich foods. All right. And even, I just wanted to highlight the beef study here because I think this is really relevant. So beef doesn't have any calcium, very little, if at any, calcium or folate. But you do see that just having beef as part of a diet also brings along those accompanying other foods that can also increase calcium and folate. And you'll see this with nuts and beans too. When these are part of a healthy dietary pattern, many of these foods work in cohort together to help with nutrient adequacy. And so I think this is, again, another really strong point that we have with older adults. And so just to translate the evidence from what we talked about today, increasing protein can promote healthy aging. We talked about having protein, I would say as a minimum about, greater than 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, somewhere around that 30 to 45 grams per eating occasion. And for older adults, I would say selecting high quality proteins in beverages. We didn't talk about this, but I do a lot of breakfast research, but even thinking about that breakfast meal, because it's generally lower in protein. So having it at breakfast could be important. And then 100% including that resistance exercise, I think is also another key area. And so with that, I just wanted to thank my funding that I've had over the years. This is the Leidy Lab right now. And with that, we'll pause and see if you all had any questions so far. And I just would appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leidy. You are just brilliant. I can speak for everyone to say thank you so much for being our speaker. The data and the research behind this topic has been so fascinating. I know personally for me, I'm going to be sending this recording to all of my loved ones because I feel like everyone needs to know this. But I would love to invite everyone to drop their questions in the Q&A, but let me start off on just a few that has already come in. So what are some strategies dietitians or food service leaders can use to educate seniors about the importance of protein in a way that actually sticks?
Yeah, and unfortunately, as a scientist, I can put my head on it and then just say, okay, you all figure it out, but it doesn't work that way, right? For me, it's if you can do research, but it doesn't translate, then you've missed the mark. And, it's interesting because the dietary guidelines, at least the 2020, there was some evidence supporting increased dietary protein, but we also know nobody reads and nobody follows the dietary guidelines. So to answer that question, it is those people on the ground, the dietitians, the nurse practitioners, and so forth. And I would just say, and I've done this with my mom. It's kind of funny. I mean, I don't know if it's funny or not funny, but she's losing lean mass. She's 78 years old, and so for me, it's telling them you have to meet them where they are. And it's, my niece came in and was like, well, you should have protein shake. And she doesn't like protein shakes. It's just, so for me, it's always starting about protein supplementation, because typically those beverages, whether it's Ensure or Muscle Milk or whatever they like the taste of, can really help with that, because most of them have about 30 grams of protein now, which is really beneficial. But if they don't like that, then for me, it's, well, then you talk about, well, what do you like? And for her, she is okay with the ultra filtered, ultra processed milks. Like, we're in Texas, so we at HEB, we have their brand of Moontopia or Fairlife. And the reason I highlight that is there's more protein in those types of milks. There's less carbohydrates. And so for her now, she has 1 to 2 cups of milk a day. And so it's, how do you work with them? And she's okay with that. And so I think it has to be a one-to-one. That's why we go back to personalized nutrition and just thinking about finding what they like, finding which foods they prefer, and then just having those incorporate that on a daily basis, because they can't just have it once in a while. It's making that plan to be proactive, and then having them understand. And sometimes you can tell them and they don't get it, but if you can get them going, then they start seeing benefits pretty quickly with protein, and they start feeling better, and then they can get on the bandwagon. And I would say with resistance training, the other piece is, having them get their family involved, like going out for walks and start doing resistance bands, or doing some modest dumbbells or air squats, or those pieces. I think if you do it as a family, most will say with older people, it's just having that social environment, whether it's their peers or even family, I think can be really important.
I love that. It's like a all in this together approach.
Yeah.
For sure. Is there any other risk to too much protein in older adults, particularly those with kidney issues?
Yeah, so great question. We get asked all the time, and happy to share. There's a number of meta-analysis too, looking at kidney disease, bone or liver issues with more protein. And I would say the 1.2 to 1.6 consistently shows safe and effective amounts in aging in healthy adults. I would say the only concern right now would be with individuals with end-stage chronic kidney disease. And that has been debatable as well in terms of they actually do need more protein, but that's hard to do given the condition that they're in. And so there's just no evidence that suggests that having more protein at that level, or even a little higher. So even, I don't want to go in, but the 1.2 to 1.6 is recommended, and that has been a safe and effective amount for overall health. And we just don't see any deleterious effects, particularly with kidneys or liver or bone with that. So it's a great question.
And I think we have room for one more question from Susan. Are there any recommendations based on current body weight or ideal body weight?
Oh, yeah. So most of the recommendations, that's a great question. I keep getting asked that now this year for some reason. In the past, we would throw numbers out and nobody would ask that. Most of the time, it's just on current body weight for these recommendations. So when I talk about 1.2 to 1.6, it's literally typically starting where the person is as a baseline and then going from there. So it's current body weight, outside of the fact that when you have an individual that has morbid obesity or on the high end of obesity, that's typically when it's more of a medical intervention. And that protein typically gets dropped down to 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. Just given the fact that that'd be a lot of protein depending on, because it's usually based on body weight. So outside of, I believe the BMI criteria would be if it's greater than 40, then it's dropped to just a number of 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. Otherwise, it just goes down into your current body weight and then going from there. But there's some nuances that we still don't know. And I would say first and foremost, I think it comes down to just the amount of protein at each eating occasion. And not that 30 grams or 30 to 40 grams is the be all end all, but I think it's a great starting place. I don't think you're going to miss the mark by having too much protein at that level is I don't think it's a thing. Like at 30 to 40, even in a smaller individual, I think is appropriate and fine and safe. If they're eating 30 grams and maybe they should be eating 40, I think you're okay. So I would just say, because having that maybe 2 or 3 times a day there's gonna start seeing some health benefits along with resistance training. But I would just say, that's really the amount, about 30 to 40 grams would be ideal. You can go back to that grams per body weight or per kilogram of body weight too. So you kind of just look at both of them, but I would say targeting an actual amount of protein, I think, is really important.
Yeah,
it's a great question.
Tip. 30 to 40 per meal, check. Well, awesome. Thank you again for presenting. I have so many takeaways from this webinar personally. But thank you so much for your time today. Unfortunately, we do not have time for more questions, but you can always send questions to General Mills Food Service.webinars@generalmills.com or generalmillsfoodservice.com. Also, since we're almost at time, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time today. We'll be receiving an email in the coming days that will include links and slides to the presentation, as well as your continuing education certificate. So please be sure to check your spam folder. Additionally, please make sure to visit us at generalmillsfoodservice.com for information on rebates, helpful marketing tools, videos, and new item launches. Finally, don't forget to connect with us and Bell Institute of Health on our website and socials. So this concludes today's program. You may now disconnect. Thank you so much for joining us today.